My own mother stood in a courtroom and told a federal judge I was mentally unfit to manage my own life. She said it calmly. She said it with love in her voice. She said it the way she used to tell me, as a little girl, that everything was going to be okay. And for one single, shameful second, I almost believed her. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that sitting inside the documents on the judge's desk was something that was about to end their plan, expose their conspiracy, and stop the entire hearing dead in its tracks. A plan my own family had been building for months. A plan designed not just to take $7 million from me, but to make me disappear inside my own life. The judge picked up the final page. His hands went still. Then he looked up slowly, the way someone looks up when they've just found something they cannot unsee, and said 4 words that made my brother's face go white. Nobody leaves this courtroom, and I want to tell you exactly how we got there. Before I do, I need to be honest about something I'm not proud of. For most of my adult life, I genuinely believed that if I worked hard enough, showed up consistently enough, stayed quiet when it would have been easier to fight, eventually my family would see me differently. I'm 35 years old. I'm a registered nurse. I've worked night shifts at a level 1 trauma center in Nashville for nearly a decade, making decisions under pressure that most people cannot imagine. I have kept my hands steady while people were dying in front of me. I have held myself together while everything around me collapsed. But somehow, inside my own family, none of that ever seemed to count for anything. This is the story of the year I finally stopped trying to earn what was never going to be given. Nana Rosa's funeral was held on a cold Thursday morning in early November. The cemetery sat on a hillside outside Hendersonville, overlooking a lake the color of pewter under an overcast sky. The oaks had already dropped most of their leaves. I stood at the graveside in my black coat with Bear beside me, a chocolate lab mix I had adopted from a shelter 3 years earlier. Nana Rosa had adored that dog. She used to say Bear had better judgment about people than most humans she had ever known. Standing there that morning, I believed her completely. The service itself wasn't the hard part. Watching Nana Rosa struggle through her final months that had been the hard part. The emergency calls at 2 in the morning. The 4-hour drives from Nashville to her lake house when she needed help and wouldn't ask for it directly. Sitting beside her hospital bed during a February ice storm, her hand in mine, while she made me promise I wouldn't cry in front of her. Saying goodbye wasn't a shock. It was an ache. A deep, settled kind of ache that starts in your chest and moves slowly into your bones. You don't get rid of it. You just learn to live around it. My mother managed to say something before we even left the cemetery. She stepped close enough so only I could hear. "You didn't have to bring the dog." I looked at her. Nana Rosa asked me to. She pressed her lips together. "You always had to be different from everyone else." I stood there for a moment, looking at my mother's perfectly composed face, the certainty in her eyes, the complete absence of doubt. I thought about responding. I decided not to. Arguing with her had never once changed anything, and Nana Rosa deserved better than a family argument over her grave. That afternoon, we gathered in the offices of her attorney, Gerald Hartley, on the ground floor of a building downtown. The conference room smelled like old leather and printer ink. Rain had started against the windows. Danny sat across from me. Our father sat beside him. Our mother held Danny's arm at the elbow the way she had always positioned herself, the 3 of them as a unit, and me across the table. I had sat in that exact configuration my entire life. Mr. Hartley opened the file. He explained that Nana Rosa had been meticulous. She had revised her estate documents twice in the last 4 years, working with financial advisors and legal counsel throughout. The estate included her lakefront property, a rental home in Gallatin, several investment accounts, and 6 decades of careful, patient saving. He adjusted his glasses. Then he began reading. The room went completely silent when he reached my name. The entirety of the estate, the property, the accounts, everything was to pass to me. Elena Reyes. Her granddaughter, solely and entirely. Nobody moved. Danny blinked twice, slowly. My mother's mouth opened and then closed without making a sound. My father sat back in his chair with an expression I had never seen on his face before, not anger, something more disorienting than anger. The look of a man encountering an outcome that had genuinely never occurred to him as a real possibility. Mr. Hartley continued. There was a letter, addressed to the family. He unfolded it carefully and read it aloud. Elena showed up, he began. My throat tightened immediately. When I needed someone to drive me to my treatments, Elena showed up. When I needed groceries and didn't want to ask, Elena showed up. When I was frightened at 3 in the morning and called her phone, She answered every single time. I spent 11 weeks in the hospital over the last 2 years of my life. Elena was there for 9 of them. She slept in those narrow visitor chairs and never complained once. She brought me good coffee and terrible magazines and made me laugh on days when I had no intention of laughing. Love is not what people say at the right moments. Love is what people actually do when nobody is watching. Elena earned this inheritance. I am not confused. I am not unwell. I am simply telling the truth about what happened while no one else was paying attention. Mr. Hartley folded the letter. Silence. Complete and absolute. Danny stood up so quickly his chair scraped the floor. He said it was completely unreasonable. My mother immediately agreed Nana Rosa hadn't been herself near the end, she said. The stress of her illness had affected her thinking. My father said something about manipulation and undue influence. Mr. Hartley's expression didn't shift. He explained, quietly and precisely, that the will had been executed and certified multiple times, that Nana Rosa had been formally assessed as fully competent at the time of signing, and that the documentation was legally unambiguous. I left the office shortly after. I didn't feel victorious. I felt hollow not because of the money. I hadn't even processed the number yet. I felt hollow because not one of them had said her name. In that entire room, for that entire conversation about her estate, nobody had said Nana Rosa's name. They had argued about assets and fairness and what she would have wanted, and not one of them had acknowledged that she was gone. I drove home with Bear in the back seat and the radio off and the city lights blurring in the rain. Honestly, that night was the first time I had cried in years. Not because of the inheritance, because of the letter, because someone had seen me. And because standing in that conference room, I had understood for the first time that my own parents hadn't. I learned the estate's total value a week later. Nearly $7 million. I sat down very carefully when I read that number. I immediately contacted a financial advisor, a tax attorney, and an estate management firm. I wanted everything handled correctly, documented, overseen, nothing left to chance. I wasn't celebrating. I was taking responsibility for something that had been placed in my trust. I thought, foolishly, that things might settle down. They didn't. 17 days after the will reading, I came home after a 12-hour shift to find a certified envelope in my mailbox. My hands were still cold from the parking lot. I opened it standing at the kitchen counter without even taking my coat off. I read it once, quickly, hoping I had misunderstood. Then I read it again, slowly, then a third time. My parents had filed a petition for legal guardianship. Over me, over my finances, my accounts, my property, my assets, everything, including one specific line that made my stomach drop my dog. They were claiming I was mentally unfit to manage my own affairs. They cited my profession as evidence that exposure to trauma had compromised my judgment. They described me as isolated, emotionally fragile, and incapable of handling a large estate responsibly. I stood in my kitchen and did not move for a very long time. Then my phone rang, my mother's name on the screen. I answered because I didn't know what else to do. Several seconds passed with neither of us speaking. Then her voice came through the line, warm, gentle, completely steady. The exact voice she had used when I was a child and had done something she disapproved of. This is for your own good, sweetheart. We just want to protect you. I closed my eyes. I thought about Nana Rosa squeezing my hand in a hospital room at 3 a.m. I thought about the letter, about every narrow chair I had slept in while my parents didn't come. And I thought about what it meant that those same people, using that same gentle voice, had just filed paperwork to declare me legally incompetent. I deleted the call when she finished. Then I sat in the quiet, and grieved something I think had been gone for a long time before I was willing to admit it. Bear lay at the foot of my bed that night, raising his head every time I shifted, watching me with that steady, patient dog expression that somehow made everything both worse and better at the same time. By sunrise, I had made a decision. I was not going to react the way they expected. I was going to do what I had learned in 11 years of emergency medicine. Stay calm. Gather information. Act. Honestly, if that envelope had arrived on any other night, I might have fallen apart completely. But something about already being exhausted made me clinical. Numb in a useful way. That is what a decade in trauma medicine actually does to you. It doesn't take your feelings away. It teaches you that feelings can wait their turn. Marcus Webb had been recommended by a colleague, former federal prosecutor, mid-50s. the kind of man who seemed to be paying attention to 3 different things simultaneously, without letting you see it. He read through the entire guardianship petition in his office without asking a single question. When he finally looked up, he said simply, "How much of this is accurate?" I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because the question felt so completely absurd. I listed everything. The nursing license, with 0 violations. The financial record. The credit history. 12 years of professional evaluations. A mortgage I had never missed a single payment on. He nodded through all of it. Then he folded his hands. "This has nothing to do with competency." "What is it about?" I asked. He held my gaze. "Money." He said it the way someone says something they already knew before they walked into the room. The weeks that followed were genuinely ugly. My parents' legal team constructed a version of me. I barely recognized a woman who had retreated from normal social life, dangerously consumed by her work, with no meaningful personal relationships, who had isolated herself from her family. One document specifically suggested that caring for a terminally ill relative had caused me psychological damage. I read that paragraph 3 times. They were using the fact that I had shown up for Nana Rosa as evidence that something was broken in me. Witness statements arrived. A woman I had gone to high school with and hadn't spoken to in 8 years submitted a declaration claiming I had always seemed emotionally volatile. A former neighbor described me as withdrawn. I stared at these documents, trying to understand how people who barely knew me had become professional experts on my mental state. Marcus wasn't surprised. "It means someone made a lot of phone calls," he said quietly. The worst document arrived on a Tuesday. A psychological evaluation, authored by a licensed therapist I had never met, claiming I exhibited symptoms consistent with impaired decision-making and financial irresponsibility. The language was clinical, structured, and convincing on the surface. Marcus read it carefully, then twice more, then pressed one finger against a specific paragraph. "She never interviewed you." "How do you know?" I asked. "Because this report references conversations that never happened." The room felt colder. He pointed to another section, "And this assessment contradicts itself in 3 separate places." I leaned forward. He looked at me steadily. "Either this therapist is genuinely incompetent," he paused, "or someone told her exactly what the report needed to say." I sat with that for several days. Because if someone was willing to manufacture a psychiatric evaluation from scratch, this wasn't just a family dispute. This was organized. This was deliberate. This had a plan that extended far beyond a courtroom argument. Meanwhile, my mother left a voicemail. I listened to it at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. Her voice was measured and warm and almost musical. "We don't want to hurt you, sweetheart. We love you. We are your parents." I sat there after it ended, replaying it in my head. And I am going to be honest with you, a part of me still wanted to believe her. A small, stubborn, embarrassingly persistent part of me still wanted there to be a misunderstanding. Something I was missing. Some explanation that made all of this make sense. There wasn't one. And sitting with that truth was the loneliest I have ever felt. If you have ever been in a room with the people who raised you, and felt completely invisible if you have ever been told you are too much, or not enough, by someone whose approval you could never fully stop wanting, I want you to hear this. The problem was never you. The people who need to diminish you in order to feel large are not measuring you. They are measuring themselves. And coming up short, the financial disclosures Marcus requested opened an entirely different door. Danny's records. He spread them across the conference table one evening and asked me to look. The numbers were staggering, nearly $2 million in combined personal debt. Failed real estate developments, private loans in default, business judgments, unpaid contractors, investor disputes going back years, pages and pages of financial obligation. I sat back in my chair and felt the scattered pieces I had been carrying separately suddenly locked together. The lawsuit, the manufactured witnesses, the fabricated psychological report, the coordinated pressure. $7 million could erase every single one of those debts. All it required was a judge declaring his sister incompetent. Then the anonymous message arrived. No name, no contact information, just a single sentence in my inbox. Look into Lakeside Fiduciary Partners, LLC. Nothing else. 5 words. I forwarded it to Marcus immediately. That night, Bear lay beside me on the porch, while the Nashville lights glowed low across the skyline. I thought about Nana Rosa. She used to say that when someone works extremely hard to hide something, it almost always means the thing is genuinely worth finding. For the first time in months, I felt something other than exhaustion. I felt focused. Marcus hired a forensic analyst. I began my own research in parallel. It took less than 48 hours to find the first serious problem. Lakeside Fiduciary Partners LLC had been incorporated 6 weeks before Nana Rosa died, not after the will was read, not after the dispute began. Before any of it, at a time when, as far as anyone knew, the estate was expected to pass quietly within the family. Someone had built a financial receiving structure before there was anything confirmed to receive. The second problem: the company's ownership was buried behind layered nominee registrations. Someone had deliberately made it difficult to trace. And the third, the one that changed everything, a forensic trail through business filing databases eventually led to a single name: Don Reyes. I laughed when Marcus showed me the report, a short, flat sound with nothing of humor in it, because now it was all completely visible. If a judge declared me legally incompetent, my parents would control my finances as legal guardians. If they controlled my finances, they controlled the inheritance. And if they controlled the inheritance, Danny's company, formed specifically for this purpose, 6 weeks before my grandmother's death, would manage those assets for professional fees that would quietly dissolve $7 million into a man who couldn't pay his own mortgage. He hadn't been planning to steal from me, I realized. In his own mind, he had been correcting an injustice. That is the most unsettling part of all. 6 weeks before the hearing, a man named Kevin Osei contacted Marcus through a secure channel. He had worked as office manager at Danny's most recent development company. He was nervous, wanted confidentiality, wanted assurances, wanted time to think it over. Eventually, we drove to a diner outside the city on a quiet Monday morning. Kevin sat with his back to the wall and his eyes moving between the door and the windows. He said, "I shouldn't be here." I asked him why he was. He looked at me for a long moment. "Because your grandmother helped my mother once, years ago. And I can't pretend I don't know what I know." He opened a folder on the table between us. Emails, meeting notes, financial projections, internal memos from Lakeside Fiduciary Partners. One email featured my father's name, another my mother's. A third was written by Danny himself. Subject line: Post, Guardianship Asset Transfer Timeline. I read it once, then twice. Danny had not only planned the movement of assets following a successful guardianship ruling, he had estimated the management fees his company would collect, broken down by account type, over a 5-year horizon. He had done the math on inheriting my grandmother's legacy before the legal proceedings had even been scheduled. Kevin passed a flash drive across the table. Audio recordings, phone calls, internal meeting recordings, hours of material. And one recording in particular, Danny's voice, unmistakable, confident, easy, saying, "Once we get the guardianship, everything else is just paperwork. She won't even see it coming." Someone else in the room laughed. Danny kept talking. Asset timelines, transfer strategies, projected fee structures. My hands tightened against the edge of the table. I thought about Nana Rosa alone in a hospital room in February. I thought about the letter. I thought about Danny, who had not visited her once in 2 years, sitting in a meeting, building spreadsheets around her legacy. Marcus asked Kevin directly, who else had been aware of the plan. Kevin looked at the table, then back at us. Everyone at those meetings. A pause, including your parents. They weren't confused about what they were agreeing to. The silence in that diner lasted a long time. I drove home alone that evening. Bear met me at the door. I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet and that large, patient dog pressed against my side, and I let myself feel it, not the anger, not the strategy, not the forward planning, the grief. Because whatever I had believed about my family, whatever small hope I had kept folded away somewhere protected, was gone, completely. Grieving something like that doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens quietly, in pieces, over days. But I also got up the next morning, made coffee, called Marcus, and we worked. The hearing arrived on a Tuesday. I wore a gray blazer and dark slacks. No ceremony. The courtroom wasn't large, dark wood paneling, an American flag behind the judge's bench, rows of spectators who had heard something unusual was happening. My family arrived together. Danny was smiling. Their attorney, Curtis Pratt, moved through the room with the practiced ease of a man who had never publicly doubted himself. Marcus leaned over quietly. "He looks comfortable. Should that worry us?" He considered. "Only if he has something we don't." Otherwise it means he doesn't know what we have. Curtis Pratt opened for nearly 45 minutes. He described me as a woman defined entirely by institutional structure, trained to follow protocols, to operate within systems, to defer to hierarchy. He suggested, with visible sincerity, that this particular background might not translate into the capacity to manage significant personal wealth independently. He gestured toward me at one point. He performed. He was genuinely good at it. I watched him the way I watch a monitor in a trauma bay, not with emotion, with attention. Waiting. His witnesses came one after another. The acquaintance I hadn't spoken to in 8 years. The former neighbor who found me withdrawn. The therapist who had written an evaluation without ever meeting me. I noticed something about all 3 of them. Under the judge's questions, which became noticeably sharper as the morning progressed, not one of them could provide a single specific example to support their claims. Every statement was general, carefully worded, impressionistic. The therapist in particular hesitated visibly when the judge asked whether she had personally conducted the face-to-face assessment referenced on page 4 of her report. The hesitation lasted less than 2 seconds. In a courtroom, 2 seconds is a very long time. At lunch, Danny walked close enough to our table that I could hear him without effort. "You should take the settlement," he said quietly. "Save yourself the embarrassment." He walked away smiling. I watched him go. Marcus said nothing for a moment. Then, "He thinks he's ahead," I said. "Good." And I meant it because overconfidence makes people careless, and careless people stop watching what's directly in front of them. The afternoon session began with our defense. Marcus did not pace. He did not perform. He stood at the podium and presented information the way a skilled clinician presents a diagnosis, methodically, without drama, trusting the evidence entirely to carry its own weight. He introduced my professional record first. Years of evaluations, commendations, 0 disciplinary actions. He introduced my financial history. Mortgage records, credit reports, tax returns, savings documentation, 12 consecutive years of complete, uninterrupted financial responsibility. An independent forensic financial analyst testified for over an hour that every decision I had made since inheriting the estate was reasonable, properly documented, and conservative by any professional standard. When Curtis attempted cross-examination, the expert remained completely unmoved. Then Marcus introduced the full asset inventory. The judge requested a thorough review. Pages of documentation delivered to the bench: property valuations, investment holdings, trust structures, updated account balances. The full picture of what Nana Rosa had built over 60 years of patient, careful, disciplined work. The total, closer to $7.5 million with updated assessments included, seemed to register with the gallery. Danny shifted slightly in his chair. The judge kept reading. Then he stopped. He turned back a page, then forward again, then to a separate attachment near the back of the filing. Something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, just subtly, the way a sky changes when weather is genuinely coming in. He adjusted his glasses. He turned another page. Then, another. His jaw tightened once, briefly. He turned to a section near the back. Then he went completely still. What he was looking at were transfer authorization forms bearing my signatures I had never given. Power of attorney documents directing my assets to Lakeside Fiduciary Partners. Asset management agreements addressed to Danny's company. Every document dated months before the hearing, months before any ruling had been issued. Paperwork prepared in advance of a victory they had assumed was already guaranteed. The room had gone absolutely quiet. The kind of quiet that has texture. The judge turned to the final section, the audio transcript. Danny's voice printed on the page. "Once we get the guardianship, everything else is just paperwork." He looked up. He did not look at me. He looked at Danny first, a long, level look. Then at my parents. Then at Curtis Pratt. Then his eyes moved to Marcus. And when he spoke, his voice was controlled and flat and carried clearly to every corner of that room. "Mr. Webb, what exactly am I looking at?" Marcus stood. "Evidence of a coordinated attempt to obtain legal guardianship through fraudulent means, Your Honor, including fabricated medical documentation, forged financial authorizations, and prearranged asset transfer agreements directed to a shell company formed in anticipation of a favorable ruling." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The judge placed the documents carefully on the bench. He looked at the bailiff near the door, then at the clerk. He pushed his chair back. He stood, This hearing is suspended." His voice was steady and final and left no room. "No one leaves this courtroom." He turned to the clerk. "Courthouse security. Now. And I want certified copies of all submitted evidence forwarded to the district attorney's office before end of day." He turned toward the bailiff. "Preserve everything." A sound moved through the gallery, not quite a gasp, something lower and more collective than that. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father turned to look at Danny. Danny looked at the floor. And I watched my brother's face, the face of a man who had been smiling all morning, who had leaned over at lunch to offer me a settlement with quiet confidence, who had spent months in the absolute certainty that this was already finished, and I watched the certainty drain out of it completely. What replaced it wasn't guilt. It was fear. Real fear. The fear of someone who has just understood, for the first time in his life, that consequences exist and they have arrived. What happened next was painful to watch, even for me. Under pressure, with security officers now positioned at the exits, the family stopped being a family. My father asked Danny what was in the documents. Danny said they had been misrepresented. My mother said she hadn't fully understood the paperwork she had signed. Curtis said he had not reviewed those specific files. Danny said Curtis had been fully informed. Everyone began protecting themselves simultaneously, and the contradictions multiplied with every exchange. Timelines stopped matching. Details shifted every time someone opened their mouth. The judge watched all of it with the steady, practiced patience of someone who had seen this exact scene play out many times before. His expression never changed. Marcus leaned toward me quietly. "Watch this part." "What part?" "The part where they stop being a family." I hated that he was right. The proceedings ended that afternoon not with a verdict, but with an investigation. Federal investigators were notified within the week. Forged documents connected to a guardianship petition carry serious federal implications. Fabricated psychiatric documentation compounds them significantly. Lakeside fiduciary partners dissolved within 60 days. Multiple professional disciplinary proceedings followed. The guardianship petition was dismissed with formal findings confirming my complete and unambiguous competency. I won't detail every legal outcome, partly because some things are still ongoing, and partly because the resolution was never actually the point of this story. 6 months later, a letter arrived in my mother's handwriting. It sat on my kitchen counter for 2 full days before I opened it. 3 pages. Apologies and explanations, and a paragraph about how much Danny had manipulated everyone. A paragraph about how much they had always loved me, and how they hoped I knew that, and how they wished things had been different. I read every word carefully. Then I folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and put it in a drawer. I didn't respond. Not out of anger, not out of revenge. Because some doors, once they have closed all the way, don't benefit from being reopened. Closing them is not cruelty. Sometimes it is the most honest thing you can do. In the spring, I drove up to Nana Rosa's lake house for the first time since everything had settled. Bear rode in the back seat. The property was exactly as she had left it, the dock stretching out over the water, the flower beds she had tended herself until the last season she was physically able, the porch where she used to sit every morning with her coffee and watch the mist rise off the lake. I walked through every room slowly. I stood in her kitchen for a long time. Then I took my coffee outside, sat in her chair, and watched the early light move across the water. Bear lay at my feet. The lake was perfectly still. Nana Rosa used to tell me something I was too young to fully understand when she first said it. "People can take your things," she said. "They can take your reputation. They can spend years trying to take your future. But they cannot take your character unless you hand it to them." I understand it now. The inheritance was real, and I am grateful for it. But the actual gift she left me had nothing to do with money. It was the understanding that my worth was never dependent on being chosen by my parents, by my brother, by anyone. She saw that clearly, for years, while no one else was paying attention. And the most important thing that happened in that courtroom wasn't the judge standing up, or the security officers at the doors, or the investigation that followed. It was me sitting calmly at that defense table, knowing the truth, and trusting that it would carry its own weight without me forcing it. That patience was what she gave me, and no one could forge a signature on that. This story taught me that the hardest work isn't winning. It's refusing to become what the fight wants to make you. There were moments in those months sitting alone in my kitchen with forged documents on the counter, and my mother's voice still in my ear when I wanted to burn the whole thing down. To confront them, to force them to hear me. And what I know now is this: People who are willing to manufacture a psychiatric evaluation to take your life from you are not people who will hear you. They have already decided who you are. Your job is not to change their decision. Your job is to stay exactly who you are until reality arrives on its own. The mistake I made for years was treating their approval like a resource I needed to survive. I kept going back to the same well, over and over, and being surprised when it was dry. If there is one thing I would ask you to take from this story, one specific, concrete thing, write down the names of 3 people who have consistently shown up for you. Not the people you have been trying to earn. The people who arrived without being asked. The people who answered the phone at 3 in the morning. Those are your people. Put your energy there. And here's the question I'll leave you with. If the people who raised you came after you, not with anger, but with paperwork, with slow, quiet, deliberate architecture, manipulation, dressed up as love, would you have stayed grounded enough to build the case? Or would you have reacted exactly the way they expected? I genuinely want to know. Type 1 in the comments if you think staying calm and building the evidence was the right call. Type 2 if you believe I should have confronted them directly before it ever reached a courtroom. Type 3 if you honestly don't know what you would have done, because that is the most honest answer of all, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with it. Tell me where you are watching from right now. Tell me what time it is where you are. And if you have ever had someone try to take something from you, your reputation, your credibility, your sense of who you are, I want to hear that story too. This community exists for exactly that. If this stayed with you, please subscribe. I share stories like this one every single week. Stories about ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances without losing themselves in the process. You might need one of them someday. I want it to be there when you do. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Nashville, Tennessee, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.